Well, good morning. Can you hear me? My name is Trisha Paul. I'm with Energy Trust of Oregon. I'm outreach manager with the New Buildings program. I help project teams identify energy efficiency pieces of equipment, and then we help pay for them. I'm joining Randy here and Wendy today to talk to you all about solar and some of the best practices. I get the fortunate experience of spending a lot of time with project teams, and so I learned quite a bit myself. We're going to have some questions for the panelists, and hopefully you walk away with some strategies on incorporating solar into your design, funding some sources and processes, tips and tricks, really. I mean, my experience is these two have so much knowledge stuck in their heads and it never gets out. Like I said, I get to sit with them around the table as they creatively solve problems and identify resources and go after not only funding sources, but solving problems throughout the process. Hi there. It looks like we got to check on the thermostat here. Probably going to warm up a little bit after this. I thought it was cold out in the halls there. Making the most out of your solar installation. So quite a few years ago, Energy Trust of Oregon established a trade ally network, and that's a whole partnership of installers out in the field supporting projects, installing commercial, residential, industrial applications. Part of the renewables team. That was a big step. Randy, of course, is one of our solar trade allies. So we're partnering today. There was some question in affordable multifamily around how to more solar on projects. You know, the benefits of solar, we'll talk about later. You might already know in your own head the value of having solar on your roof, generating as much electricity as your building needs would be a net zero design. And so I think we'll click over to the next slide and introduce everyone. Again, I'm Trisha Paul. I'm with Energy Trust of Oregon. I help bring incentives. And this is to my left, Randy and Wendy. You guys want to turn your mic on?
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Randy Feldhaus. I have a company, Sunbreak Energy Advisors, that helps advise on both financial considerations for solar and also the practical design and installation. Affordable multifamily has kind of been my specialty over the years. A number of years back, I wrote a few grants to get these projects built because our funding wasn't as good back then, and just established some good relationships and really enjoyed it. So I've been lucky enough to do a number of multifamily projects since then. So happy to be here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Wendy Klein. I work for Community Development Partners. We're an affordable housing owner and developer. I'm one of the development managers at CDP. I work closely with Randy and Trisha on projects to install solar arrays on the roofs of our multifamily buildings. And we've been working together many years now. And so we're hoping to share, our best practices with you all today and answer any of your questions.
Do we move the slide?
Nope.
Okay, great. That's it. Well, I'm going to start by asking some questions. Step one, what is step one? So how early do we need to get started thinking about solar? And how can we set the project up for success? Now, I know I'm happy to jump in because, boy, I can help answer some of these questions, but I would like to start off with both of you and make this a collaboration, right? And if you have questions in the audience, feel free to raise your hand and ask. We'd like an integrated conversation. If there's something you want further clarification on, please let's just keep it part of the topic instead of waiting till the end. Okay, great.
So one of the first things I do when I start an affordable housing project is I ask what are the sustainability goals for this project? And so that is something that we ask at the very beginning. And, as you all might know, there are many levels of sustainability that are required to be achieved. In Oregon, we typically do an Earth Advantage project with Oregon Housing and Community Services. And, you could do a Earth Advantage Gold project, for example. You could do a Platinum project. If you have sustainability goals that you want to achieve, we have been looking at doing projects as net zero. In order to achieve net zero, and Trisha can probably speak to this, incorporating solar and a solar array is one of the sort of one of the techniques that you use to achieve a net zero building. So the first question I ask is, how committed are we to sustainability on this particular project? Maybe it's one of our showcase projects. Maybe it's a project in a jurisdiction, a location that has more solar incentives. There are several reasons for deciding if you do want to take a net zero path. And so that is the first question I ask. And I also ask that of the development team. And we then begin to budget for that level of sustainability.
Yeah, usually on the best projects, I'm lucky enough to be brought in really early, sometimes, as early as schematic design, where Energy Trust, if you happen to be in Energy Trust territory, will help kind of put together an early design charrette, and will actually pay for a solar designer to be at that meeting. And what I found in that really early meeting is, you're not going to have details about an installation yet, but what you can provide is just an early glimpse into, hey, what are the funding opportunities here? What are the opportunities with the roof size? And it's an opportunity to kind of meet the other trades, the other designers, because I find one of the biggest ways to help on these projects is having coordination between like the MEP design, the electrician, interacting with the architect early, just so from an early time you can help coordinate, like what part of the roof do we have to have structurally reinforced? What part, if we have a ton of condensers on the roof, can we group those in a way so they're not making the solar array scattered? So just that early meeting kind of sets the tone for, is solar possible here? And every once in a while it's not. I mean, you can have candidates that either have some tall neighbors or the funding's not there, or things can come up. And even then I can help because you need to have a building at least solar ready. And if it isn't a good candidate, sometimes I just write a letter for those folks to let them know that it was explored and it's just not going to work here. But most of the time it does. And being there at that early meeting just helps open people's eyes to kind of what the opportunities are, maybe what some of the challenges might be.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that early design assistance meeting, because I love to enroll projects early and engage in schematic design. And one of our incentives through Energy Trust of Oregon is $2,500 up to $6,000 for an early design assistance meeting. And that's where we talk about the building's energy features. And when we bring in a solar trade ally, we add $500 as a kicker to that. They have their own separate agenda. And from those meetings, I've learned about virtually net metering. I've learned about I'm going to get the names, ballasted versus racking system. I've learned about how to talk about KW instead of just KWH. So I suggest if you have projects to enroll, meet up with me, and I would love to walk you through what that early design assistance meeting conversation is. Most recently, we've added a grid integration kicker. So as the market said, we want to learn more about solar. This is sort of the strategy that we set up just to bring a professional in to discuss some of the things that I'm not a professional on. And grid integration is going to be one of those things as we continue to electrify buildings and add more EVs to our grid. We need to find out how we can make them talk smarter. Okay, so on to the next question. How does your work balance competing design priorities and implications of financing solar in your building? So competing design priorities, is there ever a time where you want solar, but at some point maybe it doesn't happen?
Never.
So I think the question really is there a time where you do not think you have enough financing for the solar array? So to give you an example, Randy and I are working together on a project in St. Helens, Oregon, and we have a big 17-acre campus with 11 buildings. When we initially started the project, we decided we would have this project be solar ready. And so we're putting a solar array, or our idea was that we would put a solar array on the roof of one of the bigger buildings, that one of the bigger buildings, and what it would do is it would connect to the house meter. So it would be able to let us lower our costs on our house meter. So the operations of the elevator, the hallway lights, the common space, the common space electric. Unfortunately, this project is in, It's in the Columbia River Public Utility District. So Tricia can speak to this as well. So the Energy Trust of Oregon only finances projects in Pacific Power and Portland General Electric territories.
Northwest
correct?
Natural Gas, Cascade Gas, and Avista.
And-
Yes.
Okay, great.
Investor-owned utilities.
So we did not have any of the funds available to do the initial design charrette with Randy or another trade ally. And we said, this project, we did not have the financing available to do the solar install. So we have the project as solar ready, and we proceeded to do the project as solar ready. So what I am finding is if you're in a district that isn't PGE, that isn't Pacific Power, you have to really finance the project initially sort of on your own. So if you want to get your teams together and do a design charrette with Randy, you won't get any of that incentive funding to do that charrette. As we've moved through the project, we've decided that we would use the contingency that we have for the hard cost to install the solar array. Another problem with doing it sort of after the fact is we had to go back to our low-income housing tax credit investor and say, hey, do you want these tax credits now that we've told you we're going to install solar? And they really aren't having any appetite for it. So instead of baking this into the project from the very beginning and capturing those tax credits from the investor, we did not do that. And so now after the fact, we've come back to them and said, hey, do you want these credits? It's a little bit more difficult to, do that after the fact, amend the limited partnership agreement to include the tax credits, sort of do the calculations, come up with the financing after the fact. So if you have, if you want to install solar, and you're in PGE in Pacific Power territory, I would say, do it from the beginning. This way that you can include it in your financing stack to your funding application. Your investor, once you have them on board, will already know that you have solar in your project. And it will be incorporated into your operating expenses from the beginning, allow you to perhaps even increase your permanent loan on your project. And lower your expenses. So it is something that if you know that you have a sustainability goal of net zero or Earth Advantage Platinum or LEED, this is something that if you have it, the earlier you have it, the earlier your partners are engaged with incorporating the solar and the tax credits.
Absolutely. And I think another process as we start is when you're trying to figure out how energy efficient your building will be, sometimes there's a little, push and pull between, what systems you are going to be able to go forward with, how maybe something's more energy efficient, but it's more expensive. And so it kind of comes back to some of those project goals. But also sometimes it depends on the goals for how much you want to shift to the house load, the house panels. There's some projects where you're really trying to lessen the burden of utilities on the residents. And so if we have a great roof for solar, we're in PGE, so we have really good funding. Sometimes maybe we're trying to go for central water heating, where we're moving some of the load for that into that house load and that we can offset with solar. There are other times where that's not feasible. And so we kind of scale back the solar to work with a house load that's pretty minimal. If you just have exterior lighting, there's not a lot of HVAC. One really important thing though, is every once in a while, you'll have one building like at St. Helens that just had a great roof for solar. So then you can kind of be very targeted. Like even though we have multiple buildings there, we focused all our attention on one building to make that happen. And if you have multiple buildings on one property and it's in PGE or Pacific Power territory, you can do what's called meter aggregation. And so that means if you're producing more than you need at that meter at that one building, because you have such great resource and a good size, you can potentially offset multiple other house meters on that same campus. So I have another campus right now that I'm working on that we're doing solar on one building, but we're going to offset almost 5 house panels. So that's just but luckily early on in the design process, we just kind of try to prioritize and be strategic. Instead of being solar ready on everything, let's get full solar on the most practical building where we can do the most benefit for the property.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about incentives. Energy Trust of Oregon provides the $500 kicker for a solar trade ally to participate at an early design assistance meeting. There's a solar development assistance. So solar trade ally would walk away from that meeting and put together a design. Do you want to maybe talk about the solar design assistance?
Sure.
Solar development or solar development?
Yeah, solar development assistance, so SDA, and that again is in PGE or Pacific Power territory. But that is a great incentive because it just mitigates the cost of having a real full design. Even if you end up being solar ready, a typical cost for building might be for a full design, maybe around $3,600 or so. But Energy Trust will provide a rebate of $1,800. So for $1,800, which is very little as far as other design costs in a project, you know, you're going to have a site plan, you're going to have a one-line diagram, you're going to have a full report that says, hey, here are the design considerations. Really just inexpensive way to get a very thorough look at your project. And then I've had projects go on from that. Many of them get built. Every once in a while, if it's coming out of contingency funds and there's some prizes, then at least we also have a roadmap to solar ready. So you're preserving the options for that building. Because one thing down the road, if you've already done your SDA, you have a design and you have done solar ready, then there are other grant opportunities down the road. And if you have a building that's already prepared for solar, you're a much stronger candidate for grants down the road as well, for like Renewable Development Fund with PGE or Blue Sky with Pacific Power. So that SDA kind of sets you up for success, whether you're building the solar at that time or just preparing the building to, you know, be ready for the right opportunity to build it down the road.
Yeah, and that's where we plug in again with I'm going to take your question. Solar ready, up to $15,000 per building is what we can help support for conduits and equipment, electrical panels. So all of the upgrades, everything but the panel. And then after, I mean, if there's not enough money in the budget for solar during construction, this is our solution is solar ready. But once we do decide, or maybe the money is the contingent is there, then we are paying an incentive on the panels through our equitable solar program or through our typical. Can you chat about that really quick? I know those numbers change depending on if you're in PGE or Pacific Power.
The numbers do change all the time. So, I mean, it's one of those things that over time, as solar gets less expensive, the incentives also tend to slowly go down. But right now we're at this moment where we actually have this trifecta of great incentives. For the affordable multifamily, there's a category carve out, you know, just for this area. And I believe it's 75 cents a watt up to $45,000. So that's, and as if it's a nonprofit developer, I mean, that's not even taxed. So that's huge. And then there are a couple other funding sources as well. I mean, the state had administered by the Department of Energy, solar plus storage. There is a category for low income service providers, and that can also go up to $30,000. And then you have your federal tax credit that now is accessible to nonprofits or transferable. So,
did we answer your question yet?
No, I just have a question.
Yeah.
Is this for new development only, or can you do renovation projects?
Yeah, major renovations. So ground up new construction also includes major renovations in our program. So if you're triggering code or if it's a change of use.
What is major renovation?
Is it a big construction site? Do you have an architect and are you triggering code? Are you changing out multiple energy systems? Are you tearing off the skin? All those things trigger. We have an existing multifamily program that works with equipment upgrades. If you were just going to change out some boilers or maybe do a lighting or appliance retrofit, then I could help connect you with our existing multifamily program. Well, we mentioned a little bit about the solar incentives through Energy Trust of Oregon, and I know there are other funding sources, but have you ever leveraged any Portland Clean Energy Fund money towards, I mean, this is a Portland audience, I'm hoping you didn't drive too far. And I don't know, with a show of hands, how many of you know what PSEF is? Okay. All right. Portland Clean Energy Fund. We tax carbon emitters and then we move the money over towards clean energy and community. I guess there's a mission that I haven't read, but there's access to money for solar and energy efficiency from this fund. And that's great that Portland's doing such a progressive policy move because there are very few programs like this across the nation. Have you leveraged any of these funds yet, Randy or Wendy?
I have not, so I have to hand it over to Randy. I've not been working in Portland, so I've been mostly working in rural areas where it's harder to find some of the funding. I'm sure folks in the room might have experience with that, and we can chat about that after Randy talks about PSEP.
Yeah, so I am involved with several PSEF projects now, and it is amazing the amount of funding that PSEF has, like dwarfs the state funding for solar. There's so much more funding there, and one of the priorities that they've reorganized PSEF after that first couple rounds of grants is built in now solar for new multifamily buildings. And so, I mean, it's not just a possible thing, it's a targeted category that they want to do solar projects. And something that's even more, I guess, special about the PSEF area is that they also really want to encourage resiliency hubs. So I'm on several projects now where solar plus storage, battery backup is a part of the design that PSEF is helping to pay for. So for example, we're in planning stages for a building now where we have, I think it's 120 kilowatts of solar, so a fair amount of solar. But then we also have enough battery backup that we can keep the lights on for all the egress much longer than otherwise code would require. We have 2 community rooms that will be have the HVAC. So there'll be heating if there's an event in the winter, or cooling if it happens in the summer. We've identified 15 different plugs that people can back up, have charge their phone. We've backed up the Wi-Fi, so there will be some internet access. So we have this portion now that if people do have to shelter in place, there is a community space that we'll have backed up, and that PSEF is funding that. There are a lot of requirements. It doesn't come without strings. There are a lot of very ambitious workforce development goals that are, I think, very worthy, but sometimes challenging to fully adhere to. But we're getting there. But if you are in the Portland area, make sure and look it up, because it is a great resource. In fact, there's a couple projects where it's taking the place of the solar for the Energy Trust in that category, because they're just kind of picking up the check for most of the array.
Right.
So
Right. For total incremental cost.
yeah.
Yeah.
So and what they really want to see is a synergy between the kind of the HVAC component or other components of the building. So you're not just generating, but there's a true emphasis on energy efficiency. So you need less generation. So you need less, so the solar covers a higher portion of the total energy that you need. So it's a little bureaucratic, but the funding is kind of worth hanging in there. And I think probably everyone in this room understands long processes, bureaucracies, and long maybe applications. So it's just one more, and it's something someone like myself can always help you out with.
Is there any conversation around process, like what would be the first thing to go after, the next thing to go after, or key takeaways in regards to what incentive programs, how the dominoes fall, kind of advice?
Tricia, you want to advance the slide where we do a little, can we, or
Yep.
whoever's
Our AV person is going to help us. Yes.
Yeah. Randy and I put together a small example of a project that would involve incentives and tax credits. And we can, Tricia, maybe walk through this example.
Okay.
Or we could walk through it with so Randy, you want to start, and I'll go into the tax credit piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is just an example of a project. This project was a medium-sized solar project, 38 kilowatts, 38.4 kilowatts. There's the project cost up there. And then Energy Trust was 75 cents per watt. So that took us up to $28,800 that we're going to get from Energy Trust. That OSSRP is the Oregon Solar and Storage Rebate Program, mouthful, but that's the one administered by the state. That's the low income service provider. And so that is also 75 cents a watt. That caps at 30,000. So we're really close to maxing out the size for that project. And then the federal tax credit is 30% of your out-of-pocket cost. So the only, it's not really tricky, but an extra detail to remember is the state incentive, that OSSRP, that is sent directly to the solar contractor. And just it's the way they wrote the legislation, there's not really any wiggle room. The great part about that is that's money that never has to come out of your pocket. That's money that you don't have to, how are we going to get through our construction budget and cash flow to pay for the solar before we get our rebates? That one goes right to the solar provider. So you're never charged that money. But you also then can't claim that portion of it on your federal tax credit. So that's why that number is a little less than 30% of the total $105,000. And I'm going to let Wendy kind of speak to the low-income housing tax credits and how it affects those.
So one really good thing about solar and the Inflation Reduction Act is that you can now include your solar array in your LIHTC basis. So you can sort of double dip in terms of tax credits with the solar. So basically what that means is you have your solar array costs of $105,000 that Randy put on the screen here. And then you deduct your incentives, so the Energy Trust and the Oregon Department of Energy incentive. And then you can still get your low-income housing tax credits as well as the solar tax credits. So what you end up doing, and this is just assuming you have a 4% low-income housing tax credit project, your investor is willing to pay 90 cents on the dollar, and then you're also in a basis boost area. So that is similar to the project that we have in St. Helens. While it doesn't, it won't be able to incorporate the Energy Trust incentives, we would be able to use the LIHTC basis plus 130% for the basis boost. So you can see in the end, your solar is minimal cost to your project. Sort of a win-win. Now, of course, the credits, the incentives, they don't, you'll have to bridge that with your construction loan. So that you wouldn't be able to, get that first cost and then pay directly. So you'd have to bridge that, and then your tax credits would come, after your panels are installed, your cost cert is done, everything is legitimized, and then you end up having really barely any out of pocket costs. So it's really a win-win now, especially in Oregon, and especially if you're in Portland. So, in terms of the financing, it's there. It's basically there for you. So I'm not sure if anybody had any questions about how that would work on a 4% project. A 9% project is a little bit trickier if you've already maxed out your basis. So, you might not get, as many credits as in a 4%. But it's still a win-win that you sort of get to double dip on these credits, which you couldn't do in the past. Your accountant would get very upset. It's great. This is a really good time for solar. So.
I think also one of the questions. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
When you mentioned PSEF earlier, when that kicks in, does that just swap out for Energy Trust?
It can. Yeah. So it's one of those things that you get into it. The smartest thing to do is to connect with PSEF. That they have staff that will kind of sit down with you, go over your project, help you, help get an understanding, what are you trying to accomplish? And then they'll explain, hey, here's what we think we can cover likely. And so they're going to want to know what other support you have in the project. But I've known, like, for instance, there was a period of time where the low-income service provider fund was fully subscribed. And so we didn't have that access to that money. And with the PSEF project, they just kind of filled that gap. I've had other projects where they didn't really require us to go back and maximize those other credits. So it seems like they're still kind of finding their way a little bit on how much they're going to do on any given project as they've been working through this kind of restructuring. So it's still a little bit of a learning process, but they have been very generous. One thing I was going to mention about this example is, as far as the order that these incentives are done, the Energy Trust incentive is usually the first incentive if you're in Energy Trust area, because if you've done that solar development assistance at the very end of that process, like when I upload all that information to Energy Trust, so they'll give us that rebate, it asks you at that time, would you like to reserve an incentive? And the advantage to doing it at that time is instead of the usual 1 year reservation period, it's a 2 year reservation period for that. And as we all know with these projects, you can be involved in the planning and building process for a long time. You might need 18 months. So the Energy Trust is the first one. The state, that OSSRP, or low income service provider section, the only thing tricky about reserving that one is the state requires a contract. So if you can imagine, if you're a homeowner and you already have a home that exists and you're doing that program under the residential side, hey, that's easy because you got your quote, you choose which contractor you're working with, there's your contract. But a lot of times on the design build side for a new building, the contract can come a ways down the road. And so we have to sometimes find a way to, I've had several times that once it's hard to have the contract before the general contractor's chosen. And most of the time it's a matter of I'll upload a contract with that general contractor that just has all the information that they want to see. What is the project? Who is the ultimate owner? What are the other rebates involved? And so as long as you structure the contract correctly, we've even done a few $0 contracts where it outlines all the building information. But if it's before solar has been formally adopted into the general budget, let's say we're having to build it out of contingency funds. Sometimes we haven't had that formal change order that's added solar. So of course the general contractor doesn't want to commit to doing solar if they haven't gotten a commitment. But we'll do a $0 contract that says, hey, here's all the outline of our project. And we just need a change order to kind of get the green light to go. And so far, the state's been okay with that. So that's been one way that we've kind of maneuvered through. If we at least have a general contractor, we can get a contract in place early enough in the process and get those funds set aside.
So many details, so many parts and pieces, so many steps.
In terms of the tax credits, I would say as soon as you are putting out your RFP for your tax credit investor, make sure to include, the solar tax credits in your RFP and see how much, they are willing to pay for those tax credits. There's also a whole nother, there's the 45L tax credits, which we're not talking about here, but you just want to make sure that your investor is aware that you're either installing solar or contemplating solar, and they'll let you know, how much they're willing to pay. Typically, they will pay the same rate that they would pay for your low-income housing tax credits. We do typically sort of bake that into our RFP to investors to make sure that they know that we are thinking about solar. The most recent project that I'm working on, it is rural. It does not have PSEF or Energy Trust. It is a little bit trickier to sort of bridge some of the gaps. There isn't that type of incentive available. But we did, we are installing solar from the get-go. It did require that it was approved at the Historic Landmarks Commission. So if you are doing a project in a historic district, you want to make sure to have your solar, baked in from the beginning and to go through that process and not have to do it after the fact. And then, our tax credit investor is, we are using that in our financing stack for our closing. So we do have solar investment tax credits. We do have 45L tax credits, and that's all part of our financing stack for closing. That project, we did set a goal of net zero ready from the onset. We are working with Randy on integrating a solar battery. And that project also is, owner paid utilities. So, instead of the solar, and maybe Randy can talk a little bit about that, the solar on the house meter, that is all individually metered, even though the residents aren't paying their electric bills. And so I'm wondering maybe if you can tell the group, how, I don't know how many projects you're working on where it's all owner paid utilities, but it is worth sort of looking at that in your model to see, because with, solar and 100% electric, sometimes you'd be surprised that the owner paid utilities might be the way to go. So I don't know, Randy, if you can address the meters and how that all works.
Yeah, so in this case, when that does work out, and I've had several that maybe it's I've had a couple that were for veterans or for seniors where that happens. That's where the meter, either you have a master meter, so every once in a while there'll just be one meter that covers all that, but oftentimes they are individually metered like Wendy's describing. And in that case, that's where we'd use that virtual net metering, or what the utility calls meter aggregation. And it's just an administrative way of applying all the extra power from, let's say if we're generating more than that house panel needs, we give them a list of meters ahead of time that just says, hey, if we have leftover credits for the amount of energy we put back on the grid, we want them applied to these other meters. And they don't have a limit. So I mean, like I have a project where we have 10 meters listed underneath there. So if solar first hits that house panel and eliminates that down to 0, and then as there are extra kilowatt hours that you generate, those are going to the meters that you have to do early on. As soon as it's built and you have meter numbers, you have to kind of send them that list, but then administratively they'll supply or apply that excess power. So it's really helpful.
And Oregon allows for net metering, right? That's a legislative directive for net metering, which isn't the same in other states.
True. So net metering is just keeping track of how much energy a given property is taking from the utility and how much energy that building is putting back on the grid, and what is that net. And so that is right now still a full retail value. So it's kind of there's always, the utilities don't like this, is expensive power for them. And so it's a little battle that pops up all around the US. But right now, Oregon's been great. And we still get full retail value for those kilowatt hours. So if you're getting charged 10 cents a kilowatt hour for your power, you put anything back on that grid, you're getting a full 10 cents of value for it. The only caveat to that is they do true it up once a year. So you can have any given month, if you have a credit, that credit rolls forward and will be applied in a month when you aren't generating enough solar. So if you generate a lot in the summer, you might have credits that get applied in the fall and the winter. And then that gets trued up at the end of March each year. So like when someone like myself is looking at a system and trying to design it, another point that we haven't really talked about is it's really important to get an energy model. And the energy models, they're never exact. They're always an educated best guess, but it gives me at least a target for about how much generation we'll need, so we don't overbuild your system, because they're not going to give you credit beyond that annual mark. That'll get donated to a low income electricity fund, which is also good, but you're trying to minimize your capital expense on the solar.
We talked a little bit earlier about capital equity or tax equity partners, but we did want to chat a little bit about a CPA, right? All of these things require numbers moving around on a spreadsheet. And who is the best person to do that for you? How early do you engage that person? And what does that process look like?
So we typically in our office have our CPA look at our pro forma and also at the LPA before closing, to just make sure that we've captured our tax credit basis correctly. It can get a little bit tricky. You want to make sure that your basis is correct. You don't want a big surprise at the end, especially if you have a very big project and you don't get the basis that you had anticipated. So we will have the person that's doing our cost cert take a look, review the basis, make sure we've captured our solar tax credits, our eligible basis correctly. When it comes time to do your cost cert, your accountant, your CPA will separate out those costs and true them up for your investor. So, you might have a tax credit. You might think it's $22,000. Your cost might be a little bit higher. You might get a little bit less. You might get a little bit more, but it's usually, in the ballpark. It's just a good double check measure to make sure you're calculating your basis correctly. So, it's not mandatory, but it's something that we do like to do to make sure that we're hitting that eligible basis number correctly. Was that your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Randy, do you interface with a CPA at all?
Often, yes. Just because a lot of times solar is a little specialized. So some CPAs have worked with a lot of solar projects, but oftentimes they may not have. And the landscape's always changing. Like the Inflation Reduction Act is still in the process of being implemented, and we're still getting guidance that comes out. So oftentimes CPAs will, give me a call or we'll set up a meeting just to go over exactly what the costs are, what the latest is from the Treasury Department on how we're supposed to handle these things. Like for instance, if you're going to transfer your credit, that's an important thing for everybody to know early on. So one of the things now, your tax equity partner, you don't have to, like if you had some other local business that wanted the tax credits, I don't find that to be the case very often, but you could transfer it to them. But the first person that always comes up is the tax equity because they're already familiar with the concept, they're already doing it. Just let them know early on and have that CPA involved early on. The other thing that the CPA should be aware of is it's not just the solar contractor that can be that total solar cost, because oftentimes there are some solar elements with the main electrical contractor. The main electrical contractor may be installing conduit to the roof because it makes more sense for sequencing along construction. They may be ordering the PV breaker as a part of the main electrical equipment. So there's some cost there that also is eligible to be captured as part of that federal tax credit. And sometimes if you're having a general contractor that is building it for you, there may be an administrative cost to having that general contractor oversee that. Might be 3 or 4% or something. So generally your general contractor can also help you with the final cost, because that's who you as the developer typically are paying. Usually I'll be contracted, the solar person be contracted under the general. And so that final bill for solar will come from the general versus your solar contractor. So just be aware that there's, let's say the solar costs 105,000. There might be another $5,000 or $10,000 of cost that came from the general that you can include in your total tax credit.
Good advice. We've talked about PSEF, a very local fund. We've talked about Energy Trust of Oregon, PG Impact Power, PSEF only if you're in Portland. We've talked about the ODO. We talked about the Department of Energy, Oregon Department of Energy. Can we switch gears and talk a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act? So we know that interest rates are high, cost to construct is high, cost escalation is going up and up and up. So in this current environment, Wendy, it's fascinating that you can still build net zero or path to net zero buildings, leveraging with solar. So my question is to chat a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act, because I know there's still information coming down from the Treasury Department on how we can leverage some of those funds. But then also, Wendy, what is your mission towards continuing to push for this mission in such a volatile financial world? So either one of you can go first. Maybe a little different question for each of you.
So we have been moving towards, 100% electric buildings. I think, that's generally what we're starting to see, on the West Coast, especially. And so, that does come with additional costs. So those costs we are typically seeing in our hot water heating. So to go from a gas central boiler to a heat pump hot water heater can be quite a significant cost add. The solar, as you can see, is sort of pays for itself, but we've also been trying to incorporate elements like the solar battery that Randy's talking about, just due to sort of extreme weather, power outages, very vulnerable residents. We do want to put some, sort of critical items on the solar battery backup. So that would include something like a fridge for folks' medication in case the power were to go out. We're working with Randy on trying to see how we can get the solar battery to operate the elevator in case of a power outage. You could imagine for folks with mobility impairments or folks in their rooms, that have a hard time walking downstairs, powering that elevator, without using a generator filled with, oil or gas or diesel. That's a very exciting prospect. So, I think the question really is how to prioritize some of these sustainability elements, when we're faced with, very high interest rates, when we're faced with high construction costs, when we're faced with, high soft costs. And the Inflation Reduction Act, the fact that, we can include these, the solar in basis now and sort of double dip when we couldn't have before is huge for that. Another question about the Inflation Reduction Act, and Randy might be more on top of this than I am, but it's, there's going to be an opportunity for affordable housing to apply to increase your solar incentive, tax credit incentive, or tax credit, solar investment tax credit to 50% rather than the 30%. And I don't know, Randy, if you know what it would take for a project to apply for that. I know it's going to be a competitive application. But do you have more information on that?
I do have a little, and this is an area that's still developing a little bit, but for projects, the typical size that we're talking about, that 30% is kind of your basic. We know we're going to get this 30% federal tax credit. We'll be eligible for that. But then there's also another 10% that you can get if you have a high enough domestic content. So there's if we have a racking company that's using American steel, a solar panel company that is, manufacturing in the US, if we can hit domestic content standards, which is getting, all the big manufacturers are aware of this and know it's an advantage. So there's a lot of factories in the works right now increasing domestic production. It's really been fun to see with this particular legislation. It is having a profound impact on solar and renewable energy. So it also includes battery backup. So that 30%, that's the solar, that's the battery backup. And then besides that, if you are in a low income community, and that can be, there are some technical definitions here that I would have, it's a certain amount below the median income of the area, or a census tract that is considered low income, you can get another extra 10%. And for that 10%, you do have to register your project. It's not an automatic thing. So the dicey thing about the bonuses is usually your tax equity partner wants some certainty to plan around. They want to have a number. And so it's sometimes a little challenging because you're like, well, I know I have this 30% number, and I might have this other 20% that I can add to it. And so that's a early conversation to have, so they're aware, and you can find out what flexibility that they have, what appetite that they have. The other thing is, if it is a community, if it's specifically a low income residential project, like multifamily project, like you all have, especially if it benefits the actual tenants. So for instance, I have one where it's primarily focused for helping to house unhoused veterans. And so in that case, the utilities are being paid by the owners on that one. So we are clearly providing a direct benefit to the tenants in that case. And so we would actually be able to apply for 20%. So we have our 30% there, we have that 20% kicker for the low income, and potentially even the 10% for domestic content. And that's a lot to remember, but I guess the important thing is that there are some great bonuses out there. And I think the one takeaway would be, just remember to ask whoever your solar contractor is about those bonuses and how do you pre-register for those. Because we're still waiting from the Department of Treasury to actually get a form to fill out to say, here's our project, here's when it's going to get built. I know it's coming. I know they said that's what we have to do. And they have a certain allocation of megawatts of power that they're going to distribute around the country. So yeah, you could potentially get 50 to 60% federal tax credit if you have the right combination of factors.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to move into a little bit around construction, maintenance, and operation. Wendy, you have several buildings that have been operating with solar on them. Maybe you want to speak a little bit to that. How often does solar cover the house load, or how often does virtually net metering? I know we're always constrained by height. If you have a 2-story building with lots of roof space, we have a great opportunity for solar, but the second you get taller, then your footprint becomes smaller. So tell us about the operations of your buildings that are currently have installed solar, and then we can move on to some of the strategies around maintenance and operations, commissioning, or how to make sure you get the most out of the system you just paid for.
Okay, so in terms of the maintenance, something that just did come up on a recent project of mine that I was surprised by, I hadn't heard this before, just something to take into account when you're selecting your investor. The investor was requiring that we have a maintenance contract prior to closing to maintain the solar. Randy is actually our solar installer and consultant on this project. So I called him in desperation. The project did not have, the budget really to even incorporate, a solar contract in our operating expenses. So I said to Randy, wow, this is the first time that I've heard of a maintenance contract for a solar array. Typically I hear you really don't need to maintain them. And maybe Randy, you can speak to the maintenance and if folks should bake in, a maintenance cost in their operating budget for the solar.
So that was, I think, the first time it had come up as a requirement, but oftentimes for larger projects, like really large utility scale projects, it's very normal to have an operations and maintenance budget. You have more inverters, more panels, higher likelihood that even if 1% goes out, well, if you have enough panels, that 1% is, something's going to happen. Usually on these smaller projects, 30, 40, 50 kilowatts, if it's designed and installed correctly, there's a minimal amount to do. But it is important to have someone visually put eyes on the panels a couple times a year to see if they're getting especially dirty. That dirt and soil is a natural buildup on the panels that will reduce your production. Could be 2%, could be 10%. It just kind of depends how much is on there. You don't need a special solution or anything high tech. You just need someone to spray them off, basically. And one thing to remember is when you have the room, it's nice if you have at least a 10-degree tilt on those panels, because then we're in such a rainy climate, it really does help kind of wash a lot of that off. But it is a good idea to have either a maintenance contract where someone will come in to clean it once or twice a year if you don't want your staff or personnel on the roof at all. Or we had another one recently that I'm designing in Portland that we designed, even though the panels were allowed to be as close as 3 feet from the edge, we kind of designed it so all of them could be reached and cleaned from 10 feet or further from the edge. So then we didn't have to have the fall protection. We had a safe way for people to access it. And so we just kind of built that into our planning process of making sure there were very identified pathways and that we had that 10 feet that we had to work with. So now their personnel can do the cleaning, and that's probably the least cost solution. If you have a contractor do it, that'll work, takes off liability, but it costs a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a question. We have some design overlays in a project we're working on where we're mandated to have gable roofs for our large PSH projects. How is that going to maybe cause some issues? Because I understand flat roof or you have a nice 10% angle, but how do we mitigate that on the gable roofs?
So with gable roofs, there are a couple advantages. If you have a good orientation, but it is steeper because it's a pitched roof, oftentimes the panels do end up with less debris because it is a steeper, usually a steeper pitch that they're at. Many times you really want to make sure that your installer has done a good commissioning report and going into it, kind of like you just have a roof inspection when your roof is put on. You kind of want the same documentation for your solar project so that that if it's going to be hard for anybody to physically access that roof. Every once in a while I'll find a gable roof that it was expensive to put a hatch in. So the decision was made, even for cleaning windows or whatnot, okay, we're just going to have to bring in a man lift when that happens, and it's a little extra cost, but it's worth it because those hatches can be so expensive. Well, then there's not going to be it's not going to be easy to get even a solar guy up there to service things. So you just want a good documentation at the end that things have been checked. When you can have a hatch as access, at least they can be more easily serviced, and they will generally be still pretty productive, even if they don't get a cleaning, because you have a better pitch. Sometimes if it's not a really high structure, if there is someone that's coming to clean windows or whatnot, and you have a man lift, then you can still spray them off that way.
Well, we have about 20 minutes left. I'm wondering, just with a show of hands, how many questions we're going to have, or where we should take this conversation before I ask my last ones. Go ahead.
Question around the maintenance or the solar system. I come from the other side of the river. But we're installing a solar system there on multifamily construction project and trying to find someone to do the maintenance on this on the solar has been a little bit challenging, and it doesn't seem like that infrastructure is built up here at the Pacific Northwest.
Anybody have a maintenance department that cleans solar panels in the room?
Putting our maintenance staff up there isn't feasible with a liability perspective. So I guess I'm looking for resources around maintenance companies who provide solar cleaning and viewing. I mean, you do want somebody to check the racking, the wiring, the solar panel, along with the monitoring system. But I'm finding that those resources aren't around. Is that what you're finding, or like how do we build out that something that's pretty good? Right, the solar activity, you do have to have somebody maintain. So
Yeah, you're really right. And that I guess one thing I would say is that is a kind of a weak element, a weak link right now. Because it's hard to get someone safely to a roof in an inexpensive manner. So when you have solar that's saving you, let's say it's $5,000 or $6,000 a year or $10,000 a year, but it's costing you $1,000 to have someone out there to clean it, that's a real challenge. And there aren't as many companies as, say, California, where it is a little more mature industry and there's more of it. I would always ask your solar contractor first. I've had, I know there's a partner that I work with that it's not their first choice to go out and clean panels, but they will. And so you can set up a maintenance contract to do that. I've also heard of some window cleaning, commercial window cleaning companies that can include that when they're coming out to do, if they're cleaning windows in another area, they can also include the solar panels in that because they're used to fall protection and what's needed to kind of access difficult areas. But I would say you're absolutely right. That is a tougher part. It's easy to find someone to put it on there. It is a little harder to find someone that can get in there and service it regularly for you.
We've talked a little bit about net zero buildings and Path to Net Zero program with Energy Trust of Oregon. I'd like, as an outreach manager, I like to help projects make their building as energy efficient as possible so that the solar load could accommodate to create a target EUI. We have the 2030 challenge, which is net zero by 2050, or net zero by 2030 is the net zero challenge. And so, what happens when your roof isn't big enough to accommodate the load of your building? Are there any other opportunities for solar if you're trying to get your net zero certification?
Part of that is if you're lucky enough to be working in kind of a campus, that sometimes can be helpful. We have one where it was going to be challenging to meet goals, net zero on a number of the buildings, but we did have a community building that had, when the energy model was done, the demands weren't that high and we had a good roof surface to work with. So in that case, the whole development wasn't net zero, but we were able to plan for one like net zero focus or candidate that where we can do it at. So when there are multiple buildings, that's another reason why we really try to strategically approach the most productive building. If you are dealing with one building and you don't have enough space, sometimes that can happen, and it's more a matter of building in realistic expectations. There are those occasions that you're like, all right, it's going to offset 25%. It's not going to offset 100. I mean, that it's still a step in the right direction. So that part of it is expectations. Sometimes you can do carports, but carports up here in the Northwest tend to be kind of expensive because of the infrastructure that's required. You have a whole new steel. So financially, unless you have some really great grants, that's a tough one.
And we had a question.
For the net zero program, whether you can just sign up all your tenants for a community solar project and still meet the.
That is the first time anybody's asked me that question. I mean, I was going to ask Wendy if she's ever used any community solar for her projects, because I have seen that where, we talk in EUI, energy intensity, and if their EUI is right at the verge and they need a few more pieces of solar, then they can go out to community solar and achieve their 2030 challenge guidelines. So my question was to ask you, Wendy, if you've ever done that for your house to help out with your house paneling and your virtually net metering.
I have not done community solar personally, but your question about signing up your your residents for the community solar program. We have looked at that in our office, and I think it didn't get very far because it was basically like, we would have to ask residents specifically to sign something on a piece of paper, and what does it really mean, and the community solar, and then the payback. We wanted to make sure that we even understood it before we presented it to residents. I think it is something interesting to explore. I don't know, has anybody done that in this room? I'm just wondering how successful. Oh, you have. Was it successful with the residents? Okay. Yeah.
That tends to be commercial building and county organization. However, the same kind of conflict, right? There's so much of administrative that CCA, which is an add to a lot of overhead.
Keep going.
Well, we have done that. We have talked with paid utilities, and so we'll sign up. But I was just wondering, in terms of the whole net zero program, whether you can substitute that sort of situation and still.
I would really like to speak to that. Actually, when we, through Energy Trust of Oregon, have a Path to Net Zero program where we help you walk your building towards net zero, we do look at the solar model and how much that comes off of the building, EUI, and then we do allow community solar. And we've even done a project where there was a building totally unrelated, but they built a partnership, had a great solar array. PAE building. We've done some case studies on that, borrowed from an affordable multifamily building in Kensington. So I've seen all of that happen, but I think this is a question for me, and I'll make sure and get your business card, because when I go to my engineers, if you qualify, if your building qualifies for a net zero or path to net zero program, our incentives double. So we're always looking at the kilowatt difference between your code building and your upgraded building. So you apply all these energy measures, the number. That kilowatt hour, we normally pay 20 cents per kilowatt hour savings over code. If you qualify for net zero, that turns to 40 cents. So it would be 80 cents per therm under our typical building, $1.20 per therm under the path to net zero. So I think this is a fantastic question for me to take back for my program for Energy Trust of Oregon. And I'm not as familiar with the 2030 challenge, but we have to engage in their program on an engineering level to at least make these exceptions in our program. So let's find the solution.
Actually, I'm so glad you asked that question too, because I didn't even think of that, because it relates so well to the last question. But I do have a project right now where we think we're going to be offsetting about 75% of the house panel, but we did need to get these incentive, the boost, to kind of get to 100%. And I did just do some research with PGE that we are allowed to add community solar to the portion of the bill that we aren't going to cover with our own generation. So it's funny, it's something I'll probably do in the next few months. Right now, it's just, we just found out that we could. So if we found out solar was 25, 30, 50%, and we had that limited roof space, if you do happen to be in an area where they have Pacific Power or PGE and you have community solar projects, it's definitely worth investigating for your house panel if you want to keep things super simple as far as administrative, or if you have the ability to have residents receive it as well, even better. And there's no cost to the residents, if they sign up for it. I don't know, has anyone signed up for community solar in the room? I mean, I have, and it's ironic. I'm, been in solar for 14 years, and I live in the worst possible house for solar. I have 200-foot trees, on a hill over here, so it was not practical to put solar on my own home, and that always drove me crazy. So when community solar came along, I looked at it really early. It was so easy. I mean, I just kind of had to look back a year, figure out about how much I use on a typical year, and then buy that, sign up for that allotment, and then signed up, and now it just kind of goes on in the background. So it was not too complicated. Residents may need some help with it, but it hasn't been burdensome once it was set up, in my case anyway.
Question.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, so I actually work for the Oregon Clean Power Cooperative. So we're a community solar developer, and we're currently looking for low income subscribers for our projects and PGE. And yeah, I worked with another community solar developer a couple of years ago. It's such a new concept. It's fairly simple, but yet there's a lot of stuff that kind of happens behind the scenes administratively with the utility and the developer that it can get kind of confusing pretty quick. But I'm happy to work with anybody that, you know, is looking for that opportunity, and we're certainly looking for creative opportunities to work with building owners, to sign people up in bulk and just make it seamless and painless for, you know, everybody involved. And yeah, we're looking at like 50% discount on power rates for low income subscribers. So it's not chump change.
Right. That's big. Did we have another question here?
Yeah, I just have one quick question more on mechanical and just hardware aspects, with the solar panels versus like the new solar tiles or solar shingles that we're hearing about. Is there, if that technology got to a point where they're actually a consideration for you switching those out, like for instance, with the gable roof situation, that's something we should look at, or is that still just like a single family residential type solution?
It is still much more of a possibility than a reality. I think that eventually, if we can architecturally integrate solar into pitched roofs, I mean, that is a dream come true. The challenge is, though, with so many small connections, the possibility of error or a challenge is certainly the quality of the installation is just going to become, you know, that much more important. So for right now, fixed modules or solar panels are very reliable. We know what they're going to do. We can predict the amount of energy better. So I think for the time being, that's still the go-to technology. And maybe 10 years from now, it'll be different. But I think that like the Tesla roof is still going to be a very, very small subsector of the solar we put on roofs for now.
Blue shirt.
So typical setup, you know, the modules are warranted for 25 years with all the kind of top level tier 1 panels. And, you know, even after 25 years, they should be warranted to produce at least 80% of what they did on day one. The great thing about doing it at the time of construction is you have this moment in time where your roof and your solar have the same service life, basically, right? You're going to get 25 years out of your roof. You're going to get about the same time out of your solar panel. So if you are able to put them on at the same time, they coexist very well together. You know, I've had a few occasions on a retrofit where someone thought a roof was in better shape than it really was, and they've had to take off all the solar panels to redo that roof. And then sometimes it's expensive to put them back on, and they don't always get back on the building. So when you can incorporate it very early in a roof's lifespan, it's better for both the roof and the solar. And one other thing I'll add as far as the mechanical aspect and the fact that we have to use modules versus the tiles is having good coordination between your solar person and your roofer is vital, because oftentimes the roofing company, and it's the manufacturer that carries that warranty after the first 2 years, they will have requirements, and it does vary a small amount between the different manufacturers. So you want to just make sure that the solar person and the roofer are coordinating and checking early, are there extra requirements of the solar so it doesn't invalidate the roofing warranty.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm based out of Eugene, and we're not served by an investor-owned utility provider, but we are served by Northwest Natural. So to qualify for Energy Trust incentives, is it enough that we are within the Northwest Natural service region, or would the project or building itself have to be served by gas?
You would be in what we call gas only territory. And we have a list of gas incentives on our website. You could just search gas incentives, commercial new construction, hot water heaters, and anything that uses water. If you heat the water with therms, then any downstream dishwashers, clothes washers, and lavs or low flow faucets would also qualify. There's a lot of appliances and commercial kitchens. So that we wouldn't be able to pay you for any electric incentives or solar incentives, but certainly we have budget to pay incentives for those gas measures. Rooftop equipment also. So heating corridors, and there's controls on those rooftop equipments that help reduce the amount of therms you're using. So. More questions? Yeah. Oh, your hand went up in the back first.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Question back when we started speaking about resiliency and battery backup. Randy, what is the current siting ratio for the battery backup for if there's been a power outage or emergency situation? Are you planning like 1 to 2, 3 days max? What, like, I'm trying to understand what the industry is doing right now. Because I'm truly interested in battery backup because I'd love to do a solar with battery backup power. But I don't know whether people are citing.
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. And it is a design conversation, because what I've noticed is at first, before you really kind of drill down on the costs and what the project can support, the expectations are very high. Hey, we want to back up everything and we want it to go forever. And then you realize like, well, we don't have the time, space, or money to do that. So one of the most important things is as a team, as a design team, trying to figure out, as the owner of the project, what are our core services that we're trying to back up, and let's have the worst day of the winter, that we don't have a lot of sun. What do we need running, and how long do we need it running for? And so we recently had. I'm working on a project right now where we've had to have this discussion, and we kind of went through a process of kind of cutting back until we got to kind of our core critical loads that we needed for our citizens and our tenants in a common space, and we wanted to back them up for 2 days. And so that's where we ended up. But that conversation is kind of a little different for every building and what it's trying to accomplish. But that in that case, that's what it boiled down to. And the other thing, as far as ratios, is it tends to be like we had 120 kilowatts. And so our very rough guideline was, okay, we're going to try to back up because of our loads. Hey, we can maybe do 120 kilowatt hours of battery backup, maybe up to, a couple hundred. We just have to realize the more kilowatt hours we have to back up, just the longer it takes to recharge that. So you end up with kind of anywhere from a 1-to-1 to 1-to-2.
So I know, Wendy, you have a project that's has some battery components or desired battery components. I'm hearing that if a community has outages specifically because they're a long ways out, maybe they're in Astoria or they're clear out in Oregon City, that's usually a driver for considering battery storage. And from what I understand, and maybe you can correct me, is if you use up everything in your battery and then the sun comes out the next day, it will recharge your battery. So you could operate off the grid for a period of time, literally. Is that true?
It is, with some really big asterisks. I mean, there's so many variables. So you try to plan the best you can. And then there's a certain amount of also having staff properly trained for this event that may or may not ever happen. So, I mean, one of the things about managing your power to last for a long time is sometimes manually deciding, okay, we're going to need this to last longer. This is going to be a long, what of our critical loads, even then, can we manage better? Can we physically turn off that breaker? Heating's our most important thing. So we're going to turn off, these other plug loads. So some of that is what you've designed mechanically, but some of it's also just human behavior, how you manage the backup that you have. And so that's something we're still going to be learning about in the next few years, because it's kind of a tough staff item to train on. The other thing to be aware of, though, actually, with battery backup, if you are in PGE territory, is they will pay you for access to that backup. So now, if you have a PSEF grant or some other grant where you have much of the cost covered, they will actually pay for access, not during an outage when you need that battery. They're not going to take it right when the power goes out, but day to day, when there's maybe a peak summer moment that they need some extra juice, or they need to smooth out the frequency. I mean, there's all this delicate little dance with electricity that's going on all the time. And PG is one of the only utilities in the country that has a commercial program where you'll coordinate with them the pricing and what they pay. They have a complicated formula for it, but it's a good thing to be aware of, because like we have right now a conversation going on with PGE about how much they're going to pay either monthly or upfront, and part of that depends on the size of the battery bank that you have.
Wow, some distributed energy resources. I'll drop some big words on you. We have 1 or 2 more questions. Yes.
Are you thinking maybe like demand shaping for your buildings or for your project, where like you do peak shaping of your cost of your energy load. I know electricity is a little cheaper up here.
Yeah, and we don't have time of use.
But I mean, if we're gonna go in, I'm gonna go all in.
Well, I know the utilities do have programs, demand response programs, where if you load up your hot water heaters before they expect an event, they could pay you for that. Are you either of you participating or aware of any projects participating in that are considered multifamily, large commercial, industrial? They tend to do that a little bit more.
Yeah, a little less so in the multifamily, mainly because California has such a tiered system for their pricing that time of use can really make a huge difference if you can keep under a certain demand. It really can make a big difference. Here, the demand charges aren't that high, so the purely economic case for using the battery often to kind of keep your demand low is not as strong here as it is in California. So we find the conversation tends to focus more around the resiliency aspect than being able to effectively do the peak shaving. That does tend to be more in the industrial type of, manufacturing processes, staggering when you're starting equipment, that kind of thing.
One more question? Yeah.
Are you also building battery backup to like manage or run EV charging stations? Because usually those are connected to your house panel as well. And what does that look like? I'm sorry, I'm not.
We are doing a project with EV charging, and we have a terrific grant from the ODOT. It's 75% of the total cost, up to 8 ports. But we do not have that running. It's just the way that the EV charging was laid out in this project. It's not connected to the specific house meter where Randy's installing the solar. But I'm assuming you could do it. I mean, I don't. If it's connected to that house meter, I don't know, Randy.
Yeah, so I mean, you can, but with, I guess, if you think about like the amount of kilowatt hours that an EV uses is very high. You might have 50, 60, 70, 80, kilowatt hours. And so being able to have enough backup power to address multiple vehicles, you'd run through your backup power typically very, very quickly. So what I have found when we've kind of covered this conversation is maybe it's in that panel, but it's something that we're all aware that the amperage even needed for that is quite high. So we find most of the time we kind of go back towards just critical loads so far, just because we haven't been able to afford a battery that would really address, the needs of the EVs as well.
Well, thank you for joining us. We'll let you ensure that you're not late to your next session, get some coffee. I appreciate all the time and the energy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. If you do have any questions, have to buy the card, follow up.
Good mock